Welcome to War Bios, the podcast where we delve into the most pivotal battles in history, and I'm your host, General Biography. Today, we're going to explore one of the most decisive conflicts of the American Revolutionary War, the Battle of Saratoga, fought in 1777. This battle marked a crucial turning point in the war, as American forces defeated the British Army, convincing France to ally with the Americans and paving the way for the eventual defeat of the British. Burgoyne's plan was to march his army of over 7,000 troops south from Canada, through the Champlain Valley, and join forces with General William Howe's army, which was advancing north from New York City. The goal was to control the strategic Hudson River Valley, effectively cutting off New England from the rest of the colonies. This bold strategy, if successful, would have given the British a stranglehold on the rebellion, forcing the Americans to negotiate a peace treaty that would have preserved British authority over the colonies. As Burgoyne's army set out from Fort Ticonderoga, they faced numerous challenges, including treacherous terrain, sweltering heat, and a lack of supplies. The British troops had to navigate through dense forests, cross raging rivers, and climb steep mountains, all while being harassed by American guerrilla fighters. Despite these obstacles, Burgoyne's army made steady progress, driven by their commander's confidence and determination. The sound of drums and bugles filled the air as the British columns marched forward, their red coats a stark contrast to the lush green forest that surrounded them. Meanwhile, the American Continental Army, led by General Horatio Gates, was gathering strength in the Hudson Valley. Gates, a former British officer, had been appointed to command the northern department of the Continental Army, and he was determined to stop Burgoyne's advance. The Americans had been preparing defensive positions along the Hudson River, including a strategic stronghold at Bemis Heights near Saratoga. This defensive line, anchored on the heights, would prove to be a crucial factor in the upcoming battle. In August 1777, Burgoyne's army reached the town of Fort Edward, where they encountered their first major obstacle, the American forces under General Benedict Arnold, who had been sent to harass and delay the British advance. Arnold's troops launched a series of hit-and-run attacks, forcing the British to divert troops and resources to protect their flanks and rear. This clever tactic slowed down Burgoyne's march, giving Gates's army valuable time to prepare and reinforce their defenses. The Americans were employing a classic Fabian strategy, named after the Roman general Quintus Fabius Maximus, who had used similar tactics to wear down Hannibal's army during the Second Punic War. As the summer of 1777 wore on, the British Army's progress slowed to a crawl, like a mighty behemoth bogged down in the muddy terrain of upstate New York. Burgoyne's forces, once confident and buoyant, were now facing not only the harassment from Arnold's troops, but also the daunting task of crossing the Hudson River, a natural barrier that seemed to mock their every attempt to breach it. On September 13, 1777, the British began to construct a pontoon bridge near Saratoga, hoping to cross the river and outflank the American defenses, which had been carefully designed to take advantage of the terrain like a masterful chess player anticipating his opponent's moves. Anchored on the high ground of Bemis Heights, they formed an imposing bulwark against which the British waves would soon crash. The right flank, secured by a series of redoubts and breastworks, was a fortress-like structure that seemed impregnable, while the left flank, extending into the forest like a ghostly tendril, was protected by a tangle of abatis and felled trees that made it nearly impassable. As the British began their crossing, they were met with a hail of artillery fire from the American guns, which had been carefully positioned to enfilade the riverbank like a deadly ambush. The British troops, struggling to navigate the treacherous river currents, were easy targets for the American gunners, who poured forth a maelstrom of cannonballs and grape shot that ripped through the British ranks like a scythe through wheat. The screams of the wounded and the dying filled the air as the British attempted to regroup and reorganize their shattered formations. It was a baptism by fire for many of these soldiers, who had never experienced the horrors of war before, and it would leave an indelible mark on their psyche. On September 19, 1777, Burgoyne launched a reconnaissance in force against the American lines, hoping to probe their defenses and identify weak points. This action, known as the Battle of Freeman's Farm, saw intense fighting between British and American troops in the woods and fields west of the river, a chaotic melee that seemed to have no rhyme or reason. The British, advancing in traditional linear formation, were cut down by withering American fire from behind trees and stone walls, their neat lines dissolving into chaos as they stumbled through the underbrush. Despite being outnumbered, the Americans held their ground, inflicting heavy casualties on the British and sending them reeling back in disarray. It was a moment of truth for both armies, a test of wills that would determine the course of the battle and perhaps even the war itself. As one American soldier recalled, "The British came at us like a storm, but we stood firm, our muskets blazing, and sent them packing." As the battle raged on, General Benedict Arnold, who had been relieved of his command by Gates, rode onto the battlefield, his presence electrifying the American troops like a spark of electricity. According to one eyewitness, Arnold rode into the midst of the fight, his eyes flashing with excitement and his voice ringing out above the din of battle. He took charge of a group of New Hampshire troops, leading them in a series of bold counterattacks against the British flanks, his very presence seeming to inspire them to greater heights of courage and sacrifice. The Americans, emboldened by Arnold's example, fought with renewed ferocity, their bayonets glinting in the sunlight as they clashed with the British in a frenzy of steel and blood. The battle was a maelstrom of confusion and chaos, with soldiers on both sides fighting for their lives, but in the end, it was the Americans who emerged victorious, having repelled the British assault and sent them stumbling back in disarray. The Battle of Freeman's Farm was a tactical draw, but it had significant strategic implications. Burgoyne's army had suffered over 600 casualties, while the Americans had lost around 300, a disparity that would weigh heavily on the British commander's mind as he pondered his next move. More importantly, the battle had convinced Burgoyne that a direct assault on the American lines would be too costly, and he began to consider alternative strategies, his mind racing with the possibilities. As the Battle of Freeman's Farm drew to a close on September 19, 1777, General John Burgoyne's army was left to ponder its next move, their spirits dampened by the realization that they had suffered significant casualties and failed to break through the American lines. The British commander, once confident in his ability to split the colonies and force a negotiated settlement, now faced a daunting reality. His supplies were dwindling, his men were weary, and the Americans seemed determined to resist every step of the way. The landscape around Freeman's Farm, with its rolling hills and dense forests, had proven treacherous for Burgoyne's troops. The sounds of war still lingered in the air, the smell of gunpowder, the cries of the wounded, and the distant rumble of cannons. As night began to fall, Burgoyne knew that he had to act quickly to salvage the situation. He called a council with his senior officers to discuss their options, weighing the pros and cons of each possible course of action. On September 22nd, Burgoyne made the fateful decision to entrench his army on the west bank of the Hudson River, hoping to secure a defensive position and await reinforcements from General Henry Clinton, who was advancing up the river with a smaller force. The British troops worked tirelessly to construct earthworks and fortifications, their shovels and pickaxes biting into the hard earth as they labored to create a stronghold that would protect them from the American army. Meanwhile, American forces under General Horatio Gates continued to strengthen their defenses, constructing earthworks and abatis to protect their positions. The Americans were buoyed by their success at Freeman's Farm and were confident in their ability to repel any further British attacks. As one American soldier observed, "We had the British right where we wanted them, stuck in the mud and unable to move." Morale was high among the Continental Army, with soldiers like Colonel Daniel Morgan and his riflemen eager to take on the British once again. As the days turned into weeks, the tension between the two armies grew. Skirmishes broke out along the lines, with snipers and scouts exchanging fire in a deadly game of cat and mouse. The Americans were determined to harass the British at every turn, disrupting their supply lines and making it difficult for them to maintain a strong defensive position. On October 7, Burgoyne launched a final desperate assault against the American lines, hoping to break through and secure a victory. The attack, known as the Battle of Bemis Heights, was fiercely resisted by the Americans, who poured forth a withering fire that cut down the British troops in droves. The British were unable to withstand the onslaught and were forced to retreat back to their entrenchments, leaving behind scores of dead and wounded. The aftermath of the battle was brutal, with the cries of the wounded echoing through the forest and the smell of death hanging heavy in the air. Burgoyne's army was on the brink of collapse, its morale shattered by the repeated defeats and the lack of supplies. The British commander knew that he had to make a decision, surrender or risk everything on a final, doomed assault. That's all for today's War Bios. Remember to like, share, and subscribe, and until next time, I'm General Biography reminding you to keep marching toward victory.